There are places in the Sonoran Desert where silence feels older than history itself, where the endless sea of ochre sand, jagged volcanic stone, towering saguaro cacti, and shimmering waves of heat seem to guard secrets that no map has ever recorded. And among the Apache, people stories have long survived of regions where the ordinary laws of the world appear to bend just enough to remind travelers that not everything can be explained, tales shared quietly around evening fires of voices that drift across empty valleys without any visible speaker, strange lights that dance beyond distant ridgelines before vanishing into darkness, and unseen watchers whose presence is felt long before they are ever glimpsed, warnings that outsiders often dismissed as superstition, while those raised beneath the relentless Arizona sun understood that the desert demanded respect in ways no outsider could truly appreciate. Because the Sonoran Desert is not merely one of the hottest places in North America, but one of its oldest living landscapes, a place where survival depends as much upon instinct as knowledge, where every rock casts deceptive shadows, every canyon hides its own silence, and every decision can determine whether a traveler returns home or simply disappears into the unforgiving wilderness forever. And it was here, during one of the most turbulent chapters in American frontier history, that a story emerged so unsettling it would remain buried beneath official reports, whispered memories, and fading newspaper accounts for generations. Beginning in the spring of 1886, during the final campaign against Geronimo, when the United States Army relied heavily upon Apache scouts whose remarkable tracking abilities made them indispensable in pursuing small bands moving across territory too vast and hostile for conventional soldiers to navigate. These scouts possessed skills that seemed almost supernatural to the cavalry officers who depended upon them, reading faint disturbances in gravel, broken cactus needles, tiny shifts in loose sand, bent blades of desert grass, and footprints so weathered that ordinary men could not even recognize they had ever existed. Yet for the Apache, these abilities were not mysterious gifts, but knowledge earned through centuries of surviving within a landscape that rewarded patience and punished arrogance. Among these respected trackers was a seasoned scout remembered in scattered accounts simply as Nantan, though historians continue debating whether this was his actual name or merely a simplified version recorded by Army clerks unfamiliar with Apache language. Whatever the truth, the surviving descriptions paint the same portrait of a man whose calm judgment inspired confidence even among skeptical officers. One lieutenant reportedly writing that if Nantan declared a trail was 4 days old, everyone accepted his word without question because experience had proven him correct too many times to doubt him. Another officer remarked that he could identify the age of footprints after a desert windstorm when no trace appeared visible to anyone else. And fellow scouts admired not only his extraordinary skill, but his refusal to boast, believing that pride invited disaster in a land where even the strongest man could die within a single afternoon if he underestimated the heat or ignored the warning signs hidden across the desert floor. By early May, reports reached an isolated cavalry detachment that several members of Geronimo's remaining followers had crossed into rough country near the Arizona territory before turning south toward the Mexican border. Moving quickly through isolated valleys where pursuit would prove difficult, the commanding officer assembled several Apache scouts before sunrise and ordered them to spread out across different routes, locate fresh tracks, estimate the number of travelers, and return before darkness with whatever information they uncovered. The assignment appeared routine because similar patrols had been conducted countless times throughout the campaign. Yet when volunteers were requested to search farther west into an especially desolate region avoided even by experienced travelers, Nantan stepped forward without hesitation, explaining that fugitives familiar with military tactics would likely abandon obvious trails and instead disappear into country so harsh that pursuing cavalry would hesitate before following. His reasoning impressed the officer in command, who approved the plan despite quiet objections from several older Apache scouts standing nearby, for they recognized the direction Nantan intended to travel and exchanged uneasy glances without speaking. Only after the meeting ended did one elder quietly warn him that the western basin beyond the black volcanic ridges was known in old stories as a place where people occasionally heard voices carried upon still air despite there being no wind at all, where hunters sometimes returned. Convinced someone had walked beside them for miles, though no footprints accompanied their own, where strange echoes repeated words never spoken aloud, Nantan listened respectfully, without mocking the warning, then simply nodded and replied that stories deserved respect whether or not a man fully understood them, before tightening the straps on his rifle, checking his canteen, and beginning the long walk toward the western horizon as the first rays of sunlight spread across the desert. The morning air remained cool enough for comfortable travel, but within hours, shimmering heat transformed the landscape into a sea of illusions. Distant mountains appeared to float above invisible water, while twisted columns of rising air distorted every familiar landmark. Enormous saguaro cacti stood like ancient sentinels overlooking valleys littered with fractured basalt, thorn-covered cholla, mesquite, creosote bushes, brittle ocotillo, and scattered bones left behind by animals unable to survive another season of drought. Despite these conditions, Nanan maintained steady progress because he knew hidden springs concealed beneath rocky overhangs where rainwater sometimes lingered long after surface pools disappeared, following faint signs invisible to ordinary observers until shortly after noon he discovered exactly what he had expected. Several partially preserved footprints crossing an expanse of compact gravel before disappearing toward a maze of narrow canyons. Kneeling beside the impressions, he examined their depth, spacing, and weathering before concluding that at least 5 individuals had passed roughly 2 days earlier, confirming the cavalry's intelligence had been accurate. Yet something about the trail immediately troubled him, because although the footprints belonged to human travelers, they repeatedly veered away from obvious sources of water, choosing longer routes across exposed ground that no experienced Apache would normally select unless attempting to avoid something rather than someone. Curiosity overcoming caution, he continued following the trail deeper into unfamiliar country, where the surrounding silence gradually became more noticeable than the heat itself. Birds vanished first, then insects, until even the constant whisper of wind through cactus spines seemed strangely absent, leaving only the crunch of his own footsteps echoing across barren stone. Experienced trackers often relied upon natural sounds to judge the health of an environment, and Nantan immediately recognized their disappearance as deeply unusual. Pausing atop a low ridge, he scanned the horizon, expecting perhaps to discover signs of approaching weather or distant wildfire capable of explaining the unnatural stillness. Yet the sky remained perfectly clear from horizon to horizon, without even the smallest cloud interrupting its brilliant blue expanse. After several moments, he resumed, walking though his instincts urged greater caution than before. Reaching a dry wash where the mysterious trail abruptly divided into 2 separate directions, one continuing southwest while the other curved toward a cluster of black volcanic hills rising sharply from the surrounding desert. Closer examination revealed something even stranger. The southwest trail contained footprints matching those he had followed all afternoon, while the second path bore only a single set of prints, each impression nearly identical in size to those of the original travelers, yet deeper than expected, as though the individual had been carrying tremendous weight. What unsettled Nanan most was not the unusual depth, but the spacing between each step, perfectly even across rough terrain, where any normal walker would naturally shorten or lengthen stride while climbing over rocks. Instead, every footprint remained separated by exactly the same distance regardless of obstacles, creating an unnatural rhythm that reminded him less of ordinary walking than of something merely imitating it. Believing one fugitive had perhaps separated from the others, he chose to investigate the lone trail first, climbing steadily toward the volcanic hills, where sharp obsidian fragments glittered beneath the afternoon sun like scattered pieces of black glass. The higher he climbed, the colder the air unexpectedly became despite the blazing daylight, a sensation impossible to explain considering the surrounding heat. Then, without warning, he heard it, A voice carried. He remained frozen upon the volcanic ridge for what felt like several endless minutes, his breathing slow and controlled despite the violent pounding of his heart, every instinct sharpened by years of surviving in country where hesitation often meant death. Yet nothing moved among the black rocks surrounding him. No drifting dust betrayed hidden footsteps. No birds suddenly burst into flight. No sound interrupted the crushing silence that had settled across the desert. And still he could not ignore what he had heard, because the voice had not merely resembled Apache speech, but had pronounced his name exactly as his late grandmother once had, with an inflection so personal that no army officer, no fellow scout, and certainly no stranger could possibly have known it, convincing himself that exhaustion and heat might be distorting his senses despite the coolness that strangely lingered around the ridge. He forced himself to continue forward until the narrow trail ended at the entrance of a shallow canyon unlike anything he had encountered before. Its walls of dark volcanic stone rose almost perfectly vertical, blocking the afternoon sun and filling the passage with unnatural shade despite the blazing desert surrounding it. As he stepped inside, the temperature dropped dramatically, the familiar scent of dry earth giving way to the faint smell of rain-soaked stone, even though months had passed since the last significant storm. Every sound seemed strangely muffled, as though the canyon absorbed noise itself. And after walking only a short distance, he noticed markings carved into the rock, weathered symbols worn smooth by countless seasons yet still recognizable as designs far older than any American settlement. Circles surrounding human figures, spirals stretching toward stars, elongated shadows standing beside hunters carrying bows. Images that reminded him of ancient stories passed down by elders who believed certain places had been set aside long before living. Memory, places entered only during ceremonies and never disturbed without reason. He studied the carvings quietly until another voice echoed through the canyon. This time, not calling his name, but speaking words his grandfather had once repeated during winter nights beside the fire. An old warning telling children never to answer voices that spoke from empty places, because not everything capable of speaking possessed a human spirit. The memory struck him with such force that he instinctively reached for the medicine pouch hanging beneath his shirt, whispering a traditional prayer under his breath before turning to leave the canyon immediately. Yet as he retraced his steps, he discovered the entrance had vanished, replaced by an unbroken wall of black stone where sunlight should have been shining only moments earlier. He searched frantically along the canyon walls, believing he had somehow become disoriented. But every direction revealed the same impossible barrier, smooth volcanic rock stretching upward until it disappeared into darkness. Panic threatened to overcome his discipline for the first time in many years, yet he forced himself to stop, breathe slowly, and think like a tracker rather than a frightened man. Examining the ground beneath his feet, he expected to find his own footprints leading back toward the entrance. Instead, he found only a single trail of fresh impressions continuing deeper into the canyon, as though he had never turned around at all. The realization chilled him more than the strange voices ever could, because a tracker trusted the ground above all else. Footprints did not lie. And if the earth itself claimed he had walked only one direction, then either his own memory had betrayed him, or something far beyond ordinary understanding had altered the path behind him. With no visible escape, he reluctantly followed the only trail available until the canyon gradually widened into a circular basin illuminated by pale light descending from an opening high above. At its center stood an enormous weathered stone, unlike the surrounding volcanic rock, smooth, gray, and marked with countless symbols carved so deeply they remained untouched despite centuries of erosion. Surrounding the stone were smaller circles of carefully arranged rocks, forming patterns that appeared deliberate rather than natural. And although no living creature could be seen, Nantan felt with absolute certainty that he was no longer alone. The sensation resembled standing before a gathering of unseen observers whose attention remained fixed entirely upon him. Every hair along his arms rose, while the air itself seemed charged with invisible energy. Then from somewhere beyond the circle, a figure slowly emerged, neither fully man nor entirely shadow. wrapped in darkness despite the pale light surrounding the basin, its outline shifting slightly each time he attempted to focus upon it directly, revealing glimpses of an elderly Apache man before, dissolving into something impossibly tall and featureless, then becoming human again an instant later. Nantan raised his rifle by instinct, but found his hands refusing to complete the movement, as though an unseen weight held them still. The figure stopped several paces away and spoke calmly, not through the air, but inside his thoughts, asking why the children of the mountains had begun hunting one another for strangers who did not understand the land beneath their feet. Memories flooded his mind without warning. Faces of relatives lost during years of conflict, villages abandoned, children crying beside burned homes, soldiers marching beneath unfamiliar flags, generations of suffering compressed into a single overwhelming moment until tears filled his eyes despite every effort to remain composed. The voice continued without anger, explaining that the desert remembered every life taken upon its sands, and that the wounds carried by men eventually became wounds carried by the land itself. Nantan struggled to speak aloud, yet found only one question escaping his lips, asking what the being truly was, and after several moments the answer came quietly, neither claiming to be a spirit nor denying it, saying only that names belonged to human beings while older things existed long before words attempted to describe them. Then the figure extended one hand toward the great stone where countless faint whispers suddenly surrounded the basin, thousands of overlapping voices speaking, languages from different generations, Apache, Owadam, Spanish, English, and others too ancient for him to recognize, none shouting, none threatening, merely remembering, as though every traveler who had ever crossed the Sonoran Desert had somehow left behind a fragment of their final thoughts carried endlessly upon the wind. Among those whispers, Nantan heard his father's voice despite knowing he had died years earlier, telling him that fear blinded even the greatest tracker, while respect opened paths invisible to ordinary eyes. Overcome by emotion, he lowered his rifle completely, and the instant he did, the basin erupted with brilliant golden light that forced him to shield his face. When his vision finally returned, the mysterious figure had vanished. The whispers had fallen silent, and he found himself standing alone beside an ordinary rocky wash beneath the rising dawn, his canteen unexpectedly full despite remembering it nearly empty, his body free from exhaustion despite believing several days had passed, and the tracks he had followed were gone, as though neither he nor anyone else had ever walked there. Guided only by instinct, he made his way back toward the cavalry camp, arriving just as frightened soldiers prepared to abandon hope of finding him alive. Yet before anyone asked questions, he already understood that no explanation he offered would satisfy men who believed every mystery eventually surrendered to logic. When officers demanded to know where he had been, he answered truthfully that he had become lost, though not in the ordinary sense they imagined. And when pressed further, he quietly admitted that something had spoken with him deep within the desert, words that earned uneasy laughter from several soldiers until they noticed the expressions on the faces of the older Apache scouts, none of whom laughed at all because they recognized details he never openly described. One elder approached him after sunset, looked silently into his eyes, and asked only whether it had allowed him to return or whether he had somehow escaped. A question that revealed far more than Nantan wished to hear, for it suggested the old man already believed such encounters had happened before. Nantan never answered directly, only warning the elder that certain places should remain undisturbed regardless of what treasures or answers men hoped to discover there. Within weeks, he resigned from army service despite officers offering increased pay to retain one of their finest trackers, choosing instead to return to his people, where he spoke little of the experience except to caution younger generations never to follow unfamiliar voices across silent valleys, no matter how familiar those voices sounded. Years later, travelers